All right, everybody, so you see the title that I'm using here, Engaged to be Divorced, again and again and again. So what I'm going to do today is we're going to look at relationships that lead to divorce, but not in the way you think. So I want to use the analogy of relationships to point out some really obvious connections to diet strategy, diet mentality, etc., etc. So two things you want to keep in mind here. One, the old expression that people who don't learn from their history are destined to keep on repeating it. That is really, really important. And the other thing about relationships, which I will repeat several times through this, is the longest and most important relationship you will ever have in your life is the relationship you have with yourself. So that's very important. Let me repeat that. The longest and most important relationship you will ever have in your life is the relationship you have with yourself. Lifestyle, then, is a reflection of how good and optimal that relationship is, if it's a healthy relationship, a healthy marriage, or anything but. So let me just talk about unhealthy relationship cycle. All right, so we're going to start with this, and I'm going to show you how it's connected to people repeating their history over and over again, expecting a different result. So an unhealthy relationship cycle starts like this. You meet, you have a courtship, you become engaged, you have a wedding, which is not a marriage, you celebrate a honeymoon phase for as long as your body and mind will allow, and then you face the fact that the marriage won't work, you get a divorce, but you're still romanticize the relationships in general because of the glorification of the meet, courtship, engagement, honeymoon phases, and wedding phase, and then you start the cycle all over again, except each and every time you start that unhealthy relationship cycle, you say to yourself, this time it's going to be different. And this video is all about how and why this unhealthy relationship cycle is so representative of diet strategy, vogue trends, and always has been. Look at this unhealthy relationship cycle again. I'll put it up there on the screen for you. Meet, courtship, become engaged, have a wedding, which is not a marriage, celebrate a honeymoon phase for as long as mind and body will allow, then end up facing the fact the marriage won't work, get a divorce, but still romanticize the relationships in general because of glorification of the honeymoon phase, engagement phase, courtship phase, etc. So we're going to look at that, connect it to your mindset toward whatever vogue diet trend comes down the pipe. Do you recognize the unhealthy relationship pattern in yourself or someone you know? Let's get into it. Let me tell you what sparked and motivated me to do this. Since I started my my Facebook discussion group, my group page, down along the right side of the page, I see all these ridiculous Vogue diet trends with thousands and thousands of members, and it just makes me shake my head that people who don't learn from their history are destined to keep repeating that history over and over again. I see thousands of people signed up for ridiculous things like 7-day metabolic resets and all kinds of stuff, carnivore diet and all these things. But I'm going to explain it to you why this is such a mess and why it represents the unhealthy relationship cycle and that you end up being engaged to be divorced. So nowhere is this more true than when it comes to Vogue diet trends that keep repeating themselves over and over again. And not only are most consumers of diet trends not learning from their previous past history of falling for, get it? Love, falling for one diet trend after another, but they seem to be deaf and blind to this as well. These people keep repeating their history of chasing silly trends until they finally do learn from it, if ever. If not, they end up chasing the next diet, Vogue trend, etc., etc. And I just shake my head when I see these, like I said, these Facebook groups with thousands of members for various ridiculous diet trends alive and well right now. And yet, what it really represents is just the same silly North American diet mentality madness repeating itself over and over again, and no one seems to be learning. And yet, isn't the well-known definition of insanity, and we'll put that up on the screen for you, to keep repeating the same patterns and expecting a different result? Are people really this silly to put hope over experience? That's a common dietary tactic, hope over experience, and consistently buy into one silly diet strategy, vogue trend after another, and yet each time swear that this time, this is the right one. This is the right one for me. I finally met the right one. Are people really this silly and deaf and blind to learning from their own previous personal history, diet experience? Well, apparently so. When I look at all these groups with thousands of members, I don't just scratch my head, I shake my head. I've been researching diets and nutrition since the 70s, and it's the same crap repeating itself over and over again. And at some point, we have to start blaming the consumer who is just not learning from their own history, so they're destined to keep repeating it. But can you see the unhealthy relationship cycle in all of this? The meet, the courtship, the engagement, the wedding, the honeymoon, and then the marriage that doesn't last and ends up in divorce. So again, the whole title of this, using the relationship analogy connection to your diet psychology, engaged to be divorced, again and again and again. Let's look at this a different way to illustrate the silliness of buying into one diet vogue trend after another. We'll look at diet strategy as being reflective of the most important and longest relationship you will ever have. And like I said, it's important enough to put this up on the screen for you in big boom, shakalaka boom boom letters. The longest and most important relationship you will ever have is the relationship you have with yourself. Therefore, that's why I'm calling this an unhealthy relationship cycle when it comes to diet psychology, and why you're destined to be engaged to be divorced when you follow these ridiculous vogue diet trends. So make no mistake here now, your lifestyle either contributes to your relationship with yourself being one that's a lifelong happy marriage, or an abusive, dependent, love-hate, unhealthy relationship with plenty of in-betweens all along the way. If you like, you could look at these two realities as opposite ends of a relationship continuum. Happy marriage at one end, married to a healthy lifestyle. An epic, consistent relationship fails at the other end. Keep engaging in lifestyles that just can't work long term. So when it comes to this important relationship you have with yourself, one major element of lifestyle to consider is diet strategy, which is reflective of the relationship you're going to have with yourself and to yourself. Any viable way of eating must become a lifestyle. And this is why I've always preferred the term diet strategy over the word diet. So let's examine the current vogue trends out there when it comes to diet being reflective of the relationship you have with yourself. Are you engaged to get divorced? Most of you are, and you don't realize it if you're following diet vogue trends out there. So here, what you need to know: the deprivation and denial diet mentality is back and is alive and well. And that's important enough to put up there on the screen as well. The deprivation and denial diet mentality is back and is alive and well. You know, a few years ago, I wrote a few books, Diet Psychology and the Psychology of Positive Psychology, was starting to enter the conversation among experts in terms of diet and nutrition. And make no mistake, psychology has to be included in any reasonable conversation about a successful long-term diet strategy. But since sound and healthy diet psychology can't be used to sell vogue diets and diet trends, well, this ended up getting abandoned by people with a diet agenda to sell, which is so easy to do in the modern internet, composed mostly of social media madness, and all you have to do is gain a following and then say whatever you want to say, which I will get to as well. So Again, we're back to the vogue trend of focusing mentally on deprivation and denial when it comes to how to diet to lose weight and keep it off. And the deprivation and denial diet psychology is never going to work. And if that is your mindset, you are engaged to be divorced again and again and again. So why do you keep going back to such a mindset that just can't work? So let's look a little closer at a few of the modern vogue trends that I see on my social media when I'm engaging in my Facebook community page. Modern vogue diet trends with thousands and thousands of followers. There's intermittent fasting, of course, but now we also have keto diet with intermittent fasting. And if that isn't silly enough, we also have keto diet with actual fasting of no food combined with intermittent fasting as well, and some kind of weird holy grail of diet based on constant deprivation and denial of major healthy food fare. So basically, it's about depriving yourself of meal times, depriving yourself of specific foods, and it's denial and deprivation mindset. It's never worked before. It's not going to work again. And I'll tell you why you are engaged to be divorced as we go along here. It really upsets me, and that's why I'm doing this, and hopefully you'll stay tuned for the whole thing. So to add to the absurdity of these, we also have popular but very silly 1 meal per day diets. We even have this snake diet nonsense that combines regular fasting with 1 meal per day as well. And you don't have to look very deep at all to see what all of these vogue, ridiculous diet trends have in common, and that is they are all about food and eating mindset of constant deprivation and denial. They focus on what you can't have, not on what you can have, and they focus on narrow and narrow windows of time to eat, etc., etc. And people just don't seem to realize that a diet psychology that operates on deprivation and denial is a diet psychology that can never work for long in terms of being reflective of the relationship you have with yourself in terms of lifestyle. Then if that is your diet mindset psychology, then you are engaged to get divorced. All right? Can't say that enough. Such a diet psychology of deprivation and denial runs counter to the hardwiring of our own mammalian brains. I've written about this extensively in many of my books: Beyond Metabolism, Understanding Metabolism, the Anti-Diet Approach. Okay, like most mammals, humans evolved to have a strong emotional and physical drive to see food and want it. A mindset of deprivation and denial just puts you at war with the hardwiring of your own brain and instinctual drives. It's not going to work. It's a lot like trying to ignore your hardwiring to go to the bathroom when the biological urge comes. You may avoid the urge for a while, but you can't avoid it forever. So living in the modern world of food abundance, where your mind will notice food everywhere, this only makes this inner conflict of being at war with your own inner instinctual drives, it makes that conflict even greater. When you deny your instinctual drives, it only makes them stronger. It's like the old joke, sex and money and food only matter when you ain't getting any, right? That represents our instinctual drives. And if you understand our instinctual drives, then you know this joke is funny because it's true. So in terms of vogue diet trends, how do we end up here time and time again and again, with ridiculous membership, almost like cult-like memberships in vogue diet trends that simply aren't workable? How do you end up adopting a diet psychology of food denial and deprivation and thinking it will work this time when it's never worked before? Furthermore, instead of realizing that such a diet psychology can't work, these vogue diet trends are now doubling down on the deprivation and denial mindsets by combining various forms of fasting with other forms of meal limitations as well, like I said. So it's not just enough now to do intermittent fasting. You do it with keto, or you do it with actual fasting, or you do keto with actual fasting. It's constant deprivation and denial and telling you it's healthy and it serves your well-being. How ridiculous is this notion of going keto and cutting out carbs, which is also in itself a mode of starvation in the research, and then combining fasting or intermittent fasting something on top of that. How long do you think that that is going to work? And how about including past experience on several types of diets that tell you all about the deprivation and denial mindset? And many people will write and they'll say, oh, I'm just going to do it until I lose all the weight, and then I'm going to go back to a healthier and more sustainable way of eating. But not learning from your experience, just because you say that to your mind, it doesn't mean that's how your body works. You just expect that this time there's going to be no long-term physical, metabolic, or psychological consequences for these various forms of fasting and extreme combinations of fasting with severe carb restriction and the mindset that goes with it of food denial and deprivation and other such nonsense that are connected collaterally, like 7-day metabolic resets, which are complete and utter nonsense. Engaged to be divorced indeed. When will we ever smarten the fuck up when it comes to this ridiculous North American diet mentality madness of diet and deprivation? The result of all this modern diet hysteria is just recycling all the same old nonsense of deprivation and denial, is that you just keep repeating the same old diet psychology cycle of relationship drama and trauma, right? It's the relationship to your diet mentality madness of meet, courtship, engagement, honeymoon, short marriage, divorce. Romanticize the honeymoon, learn nothing from the experience, and begin the cycle all over again. This is the diet relationship cycle. Let me break it down to you in the terms I just said. I'll explain it in greater detail. So hopefully it starts creating a clearer picture for you, and you can move on from such nonsense and start employing a more well-being oriented, sound diet strategy. So the relationship cycle: meet, courtship, engagement, wed, honeymoon, short marriage, divorce, romanticizing the whole thing, and then learning nothing and beginning again. So you meet a current dieting vogue trend by coming into contact with it in some way, shape, or form. Maybe someone at the office or someone on social media, or like me, you saw it along the side of one of your social media things that you follow. And then you begin your courtship. After meeting with the diet, you begin your courtship with the diet by lying to yourself that, well, it sounds good, so you'll just try it for a while and see what happens. And lo and behold, you lose weight up front, just as you have on every other single diet you've tried, but that doesn't matter. So now you don't make that connection. So now with this courtship, with this vogue diet, this relationship you're having in the courtship, you're now in a committed relationship. You're going to tell everyone how wonderful it is, this diet. You'll even double down, and now you, at that point, are engaged to be married to this diet strategy forever, because this short-term courtship is just working out so well. So then you wed yourself to this unsustainable diet strategy. I mean, after all, weddings are a huge part of romanticized relationships with a new diet strategy, and then you experience quite the honeymoon phase on it as well. You're still losing weight up front and in the short term, and other than the odd internal battle that starts in your own head and gut with extreme hunger and craving foods that you're not allowed to eat, etc., etc., other than those little internal battles, those relationship arguments, you're convinced that this is the right diet strategy for you. You're so enamored by the romance of the North American diet mentality madness that you just tell yourself to remain blind to all the signs that this honeymoon period won't last, and that this marriage is a really bad idea, and that you are heading for another inevitable divorce from another unsustainable relationship to another diet that puts you at odds with yourself. When will you learn? Question, question. But you celebrate the honeymoon period for as long as your mind and body will allow. You purposely let yourself remain ignorant to the lessons of diet relationships of your past, even when they start appearing again once this honeymoon phase is over. This diet honeymoon phase is strong. Inevitably, you have to face the truth that this marriage to this new diet can't last, and you end up divorced from it, divorced from one more diet relationship that you underwent, engaged to be divorced, yet again, and yet you don't really learn anything from any of this. You still romanticize diets in general and the North American diet mentality. After all, your previous experience with dieting on vogue trends almost always results in short-term weight loss during the courtship and honeymoon phases. And what's not to get all starry-eyed and romantic about that? And then you allow yourself to forget the long-term consequences to the last marriage you tried to have with an unsustainable vogue diet trend. And then you begin this unhealthy relationship cycle all over again. You let hope over experience allow you to think this time it's different. And you crave that romantic diet, courtship, engagement, wedding, and honeymoon cycle all over again. And you just allow that hope over experience to trump what you actually should have learned and should know by now. So once again, you forget that a wedding and a honeymoon and all the romance they represent, they are not the same thing as an actual marriage. And then you end up divorced yet again, just another abusive diet relationship based on the mindset of denial and deprivation that you sign up for because it's just so sexy and romantic to do it, even though these things make no sense. Carnivore diet, anybody? And yet it has thousands of members. What they all have in common: short-term emphasis. Let's put that up there and get that in your noggins. Short-term emphasis. What all of these diet strategies also have in common is that they get the consumers to focus on short-term emphasis, even while sometimes paying lip service to long-term sustainability. But as I am always preaching, the metabolic compensation system operates in three very specific realms of time. Let's put them up so you can see them. The metabolic compensation system operates in the immediate realm of time, the residual realm of time, and the cumulative realm of time, and they are all interconnected. All these vogue trend diets that are based in the deprivation and denial diet psychology are diet trends with no regard to either long-term sustainability nor long-term consequences from these short-term deprivation scenarios. The three realms of time of the metabolic compensation system, the immediate, the residual, and the cumulative, are akin to the unhealthy relationship sequence of diet, engaged to be divorced relationship cycle as well. The immediate to residual phase of metabolic compensation represent the diet relationship from courtship to engagement to wedding to honeymoon period. Psychologically now, the romanticism of the diet remains intact during this immediate phase and the initial stages of the residual phase of metabolic compensation. So in other words, what I'm getting at is during these initial romanticized phases of whatever vogue diet trend you're following, you're going to defend the diet and your place in relationship with that diet and diet lifestyle against any outside attacks or evidence against it. I'm positive I am going to get all kinds of attacks on me because my membership groups are smaller, because I am talking about how silly these vogue diet trends are, yet they have thousands of members, and social media being as tribal as it is, they're going to come out and tell me how wrong I am. But doesn't all of this sound familiar to you? The unhealthy diet relationship cycle? How vogue diet trends work is that people focus only on the courtship to honeymoon phase. But by word of mouth, social media, people are always raving about such fads while in the honeymoon phase. They're posting pictures. They're talking about how wonderful it is. As you are introduced and meet the diet for the first time, all these other people that you see on social media raving about the diet, they represent to you that it must work. I mean, after all, how could all these thousands of people be raving about something that doesn't work and that is doomed to fail? Well, doesn't your own previous diet relationship cycle history answer that question for you? I've seen them all come and go, from Atkins to now where we have even more nonsense, like I said, carnivore diet, keto, with fasting, etc. But you aren't paying attention to any of this during the romantic, starry-eyed nature of the courtship, the honeymoon phase. This North American diet mentality madness lures you in to romanticize the nature of diet and diet lifestyle. You fail to consider that your own past relationships, most people, for instance, let's talk about relationships in general, most people won't discuss their divorce and or marriage problems as the diet unfolds over time because it's too embarrassing. After all, at one point early on in the relationship, during the honeymoon phase, the diet was working and all was well within the relationship. And you can't really go from posting honeymoon pictures to posting marriage problems within your diet mentality as time goes along. And that's what skews what people see on these social media groups. You see these people raving about these short-term results during the honeymoon phase, and then people are so embarrassed during the consequences phase with marriage problems that lead to divorce from the diet strategy. They're not posting anymore. So you see skewed results that don't reflect reality, and that's really important as well. Let's put that up there. You see skewed results that don't reflect reality. And Atkins knew that. That's how he made millions of dollars that had nothing to do with science, and that he never himself published one single peer-reviewed research paper about diet or nutrition or metabolism. So let's get away from that. Research shows that many people who experience, for instance, people not talking about the marriage problems with a certain diet strategy, research shows that many people who experience commonly known side effects of low-carb diets downplay them or deny them, don't talk about them, the marriage problems, while glorifying, aka romanticizing, the positive cosmetic effects that only last for a very short period. Courtship and honeymoon periods indeed, yet some of the internal battles that start to happen over the long term in terms of the cumulative effects of such diets in the cumulative realm of metabolic compensation. Here, for instance, just a few side effects of low-carb diets: general overall fatigue, heavy legs feeling, gradual or abrupt weakness, dizziness, brain fog, situational ADD or ADHD, headaches, confusion, irritability and extreme irritability, which gets worse as you go from the honeymoon period of diet to trying to make the low-carb marriage work, from the residual to cumulative realm of time, abdominal pain and cramping, constipation, nausea, vomiting, halitosis, sleep disruptions, which can create weight and metabolic issues of their own, skin issues, hair falling out, dry eyes, and so much more, even heart, cardiac issues as well. So imagine combining that's just some side effects that are well known from low-carb dieting. So imagine combining low carbs with fasting or with one meal per day. Listen, your own body's biofeedback is everything, or it should be at least. And a combination of such side effects is your body's way of trying to tell you that you are hurting it and it doesn't like what you are doing. People talk about short-term keto flu. That's your body trying to communicate with you that whatever you're doing is hurting it, not helping it. And yet, what is the advice? Just stay with it, it gets better. No, the body adopts. It still doesn't like it, and it tried to warn you, and there will be consequences for that down the road. Most people who buy into vogue diet trends just continue to ignore physical signs of abuse, relationship abuse, and instead they continue to romanticize the early stages of metabolic compensation and say to themselves, sure, sign me up for this nonsense. They crave the honeymoon period of diet mentality madness and the courtship of it because they lose weight up front and they tell themselves in the romantic starry-eyed phase, this time it's going to be different. Now let me explain something to you about the immediate, the residual, and the cumulative phases of metabolic adaptation. In the immediate and initial stages of the residual phase, we have what's called the anti-catabolic phase of diet. So what makes it all even more confusing is the research and pseudoscience that's thrown at you as you buy into the romance of it all and you tell yourself, isn't it dreamy? You don't understand the anti-catabolic phase of metabolic compensation. So, yes indeed, many studies show that any kind of weight loss on any kind of diet can result initially in improved biohealth markers on blood test panels during this immediate and residual realm of time in the metabolic compensation system. This is known as the anti-catabolic phase to those of us who are actually in the know about metabolism, which is a lot different than just having a knowledge of nutrition. The problem here is that the anti-catabolic adaptation phase of diet, especially one based on deprivation and denial, simply can't last. Your body's adapting, but it doesn't expect to have to sustain its anti-catabolic adaptation. So these initial improvements in metabolic markers up front end up as metabolic long-term consequences down the road. Hence the diet strategy marriage problems that lead to eventual divorce. But during the engagement, wedding, and honeymoon phase of a diet that represent the immediate and the residual phase, you are experiencing what's called the anti-catabolic phase of metabolic adaptation. The serious consequences down the road, we can see, for instance, in the Biggest Loser study. I did a webinar on that a while back. The Biggest Loser study showed how former contestants on the television show The Biggest Loser had metabolic consequences from losing so much weight so fast. Again, they just romanticize the weight loss up front. They don't consider about the long-term marriage. Their metabolism slowed down, and the slowdown continued even 6 years later. I also wrote a book about metabolic damage and the dangers of dieting and the long-term consequences of short-term fascinations with ill-advised diets, notably low-carb diets and keto diets. In that book, my book, Metabolic Damage and the Dangers of Dieting, a whole chapter I devoted to the Ancel Keys, Minnesota study from 1950 that illustrated in great detail the metabolic and psychological damage of dieting even weeks and months after the cessation of the diet. In his study, I think the diet went for 6 months. No Vogue diet trend huckster wants to discuss that particular landmark study because it's a study that clearly shows how diet by deprivation and denial leads to divorce, but not just divorce, but divorce with long-term serious consequences. The Ancel Keys, Minnesota study also showed that some of those long-term serious consequences were psychological in nature. You never end up having a sane relationship with food again, and that is sad and tragic to say the least. The point here is that the signs of health improvement up front in the short term can result in serious consequences down the road, long-lasting and often irreversible consequences, psychological consequences included. And the point here, and I got to make it over and over again, you can only honeymoon for a short time on these ill-advised diets based on deprivation and denial. Your body will eventually rebel against these diets, and your mind will certainly rebel against these diets because it goes against the actual instinctual drives of our brains to seek food and want food emotionally and, of course, physiologically for longevity, etc. Remember, the prime directive of any diet strategy is that 1, it must be sustainable, and 2, it must serve the body. Diets based in denial and deprivation accomplish neither of those things and therefore are doomed to fail. So anyone who keeps practicing this with that mindset, you're going to end up experiencing an engaged to be divorced cycle over and over again because you continue to romanticize the courtship, wedding, and honeymoon period of your diet relationship instead of learning from your past history about all of them. So there's also really dumb logic that is used to sell these diet courtships, and it's often completely trite logic in nature and lacks context. The people who employ hope over experience and who romanticize Vogue diet trends just don't seem to care. You're going to eat the promise and hope for the result. So you want the promise, even if deep down you really know the promise is not going to deliver the result. As I said lately, fasting is the latest vogue trend, and combining it with other modes of deprivation and denial, that seems to be even sexier these days. But really what that translates into is, let's just not eat. But here's a little reality cheat-sheet for you. Just because you can fast doesn't mean that you should fast or that you need to fast. And yes, there can be fasting benefits, and they can be very effective, especially with very obese people like 400 or 500 pounds. But that doesn't mean you extrapolate from that and then generalize it to everyone else, although this is a very common devious tactic in the diet and supplement world. And now some of these ridiculous diet hucksters combine complete fasting with 1 meal per day rules and regulations, and often that 1 meal per day is supposed to be keto, meaning carb restricted as well. This is just starvation building on starvation, and it's not sustainable, and it certainly does not serve the body. And there's going to be long-term consequences for that once the divorce phase comes and you realize that you can't stay on the diet anymore. But what happens is, in these initial stages, as long as the scale's moving, then that represents that the promise is delivering the results. But in reality, future consequences are building because your body will react to starvation. It's just a matter of time. We cannot possibly get all the nutrients we need from 1 meal per day, especially when we consider how nutrients often compete with each other for retention and absorption. That's another subject for another time. I'll use an example. If I had to eat all of my 5 meals in 1 meal, or with an arbitrary self-imposed 8-hour eating window, well, first of all, eating all my 5 meals in 1 meal would be impossible because my meals are that big. And the latter, eating them within an 8-hour eating window, would cause me all kinds of digestive stress. And furthermore, I need the specific nutrients of each and every meal that these meals provide for optimum health and well-being, and not mere survival. Here's the argument that makes no sense to me. Since when does a survival diet represent robust health and well-being? Since when does a survival diet represent robust health and well-being? I've seen this really dumb logic repeated over and over again. They say things like, this is how our ancestors survived. They often had to feast and famine. They often had to fast, and often they could only eat once per day. Well, surviving and thriving are vastly different things, people. These ancestors of ours only had a lifespan of about 30 years. They were small and frail and sickly, and they were starving. They were surviving, yes, but they were certainly not thriving. This whole eat like our ancestors argument makes no sense, and it completely lacks context as well, because if you want the context to eat like our ancestors, then you have to live like them as well, and most of their calories spent were calories spent pursuing food in hunter-gatherer communities, burning a lot of calories. They had no motor vehicles, they had no refrigeration, they had no microwave ovens. So all of these factors of convenience and not convenience mean they had to refresh their calories every single day, and that factors into calories consumed versus calories expended. So you can't just say eat like our ancestors when our ancestors were surviving, not thriving. So what they're really trying to sell you on when they say that is they're really saying, let's starve like our ancestors. That would be really good for us. Starvation diet, that would be really good for us. It is absolutely and utterly absurd and ridiculous. And again, while fasting can certainly be healthy for some people some of the time, in otherwise healthy people, fasting can also cause all kinds of digestive problems, as can consuming only 1 meal per day. The lack of consistent fiber intake can lead to constipation. What you see there is, you want to go back to our ancestors. Well, it's well known that in the research that our ancestors consumed up to 100 grams of fiber per day, and yet modern man in the North American world consumes less than a third of that if they follow the standard American diet. So there's already all kinds of contradictions. people contradicting themselves when they don't understand the science of the metabolic compensation system as well as digestion itself, and 1 meal per day and fasting, etc. The lack of consistent exercise of the digestive tract can lead to bloating and distension and cramping when you do finally eat a decent sized meal. So let's also remember one of the arguments that I constantly make: metabolism has to be fed, not starved. The reason my cycle diet is so different and always has been from all these other vogue trends is because the cycle diet turns our backs on this whole deprivation and denial mindset nonsense. The cycle diet combines constant feeding in mild relative calorie deficits with refeeding and often even overfeeding. The cycle diet caters to our evolved mammalian brain that seeks food and wants food. The cycle diet does not put us in opposition to our own instinctual drives. It accepts them and tries to work with them. A sound diet strategy is one where diet psychology is inclusive, not exclusive, like the cycle diet is. A sound diet strategy is about a focus on entertaining foods you can and you should eat. It is not about focusing on what foods to avoid or what meals to skip entirely and eating only within very confined windows. Every other mammal on the planet seeks its own food supply this way. They don't focus on what they can't or shouldn't eat. We, the supposedly smartest species, animal species on the planet, are the only animals that live with a fear of our own food supply. You want to talk about our ancestors, their minds and their diet psychology certainly did not operate this way. They were seeking food to eat. That's period. They weren't about a mindset of denial and deprivation that would make no sense to our ancestors. And the cycle diet accepts that we live in a world of food abundance. The cycle diet doesn't try to live in a way that deprives us of this reality. Oh, I'm just going to eat this way. I'm going to fast and I'm going to cut carbs and I'm going to do all this, and pretending you don't live in a world of convenience food, drive-thrus, desserts, cakes, sugars, etc. So remember, a diet strategy. Let me pause here. Let's remember, a diet strategy is reflective of lifestyle, and lifestyle is reflective of the quality of the relationship you have with yourself or that you don't have with yourself. So a diet strategy should be reflective of lifestyle, and lifestyle is reflective of the quality of the relationship you have with yourself. Get off of this whole engaged to be divorced chaser of diet nonsense. Adopt a healthy and sustainable diet strategy that is not based in the deprivation and denial mindset. It's based in the inclusive, not exclusive mindset, and you will do well to remember that. And remember, the unhealthy relationship cycle representative of diet of people who are destined to keep repeating their history because they don't learn from it is meet, courtship, engagement, wedding, honeymoon period, bad marriage, divorce, and then romanticize the early phases and stages of that unhealthy relationship cycle. And the romanticism keeps you from learning the lessons you're supposed to learn, and so you keep repeating the same unhealthy diet strategy pattern over and over again. And I'll give you an example. I already posted this, but it fits here, so I'll give you an example of the engaged to be divorced diet cycle. As fortune would have it, I was writing this article, and this exact real-world scenario fell into my lap. It exemplifies exactly what I've been discussing in this whole time, this whole video. One of my clients wrote me to share this exact exchange that she had the other night with another lady. My client that sent me this email, she's in her late 30s, early 40s. She travels a lot for a living and often finds herself in hotel bars and restaurants. But she eats a whole food, plant-based diet and has no problems following it. So below was an actual exchange she had with someone the other night. Lo and behold, she writes, "Coach, Last night, here I am at a bar, and next to me is a very overweight woman in her late 30s. We started having a discussion. She ordered crab cakes, which were served to her smothered with melted cheese. Myself, I ordered a meal of steamed rice and veggies with tofu, with half the portion to go. She told me she was being bad for eating dinner at all because she's not supposed to be, but she was just too hungry. She was explaining to me how she was trying the keto thing, so she's not allowed more than 30 grams of carbs, she says, even though she did have a glass of wine with her meal as well. I politely asked her if she believed that her keto diet was a sustainable strategy. She said no with a look of resignation on her face. Then she looked at me up and down and said, "But you're slim. You don't have my problems. You can afford to be eating carbs." I looked back at her and replied, "I look like this because I eat a lot of carbs. I could not imagine a life without carbs and would certainly not be able to maintain my figure either." And that ended the conversation. So one lady living a diet strategy, relationship lifestyle of a sustainable marriage, and the other lady fighting and losing to a diet based in deprivation and denial, and then inevitably hunger overtakes her, and yet her romanticized notion of low carbs remains intact. She's living the actual engaged to be divorced example, but she just can't see it. So there you go. As usual, some of you will get it, some of you won't, and I really hope for those of you out there, you recognize yourself in this unhealthy relationship cycle that takes you to romanticizing the courtship to honeymoon phase and failing to acknowledge the bad marriage to divorce phase. And I hope you yourself can get yourself above and beyond. When it comes to diet strategy, get yourself above and beyond being engaged to be divorced again and again and again. And I'll see you in the next video.